Hello and welcome to Rising Earth News. I'm Lauren and I'm here today with Andrew Sims, author, political economist and activist and coordinator of the Rapid Transition Alliance. Thank you for joining us today, Andrew.
I'm delighted to be here.
So Andrew, you were involved in authoring the original Green New Deal in 2008. Please can you tell us what the Green New Deal actually is and lay out just a few of its aims?
So back in 2008, I was working with an organization called the New Economics Foundation. Its mandate was economics as if people and the planet mattered. And in 2008, there were a number of things happening in the world. First of all, the thing that everybody will probably remember, there was a huge financial crisis, a systemic failure of the mainstream banking and financial worlds. But also at that time, we were already seeing some major impacts from climate change. There were extreme weather events. There were major crop failures happening in the world, which were driving food prices up. There was also an energy price crisis. The cost of oil was going through the roof, which was impacting severely on economies as well. So at the time, we were thinking, what could we do? What sort of policy vehicle could we have that could tackle all these problems at the same time? And we came up with the idea of a Green New Deal. We were thinking about it internationally, but focusing to begin with specifically on the UK situation. We thought that a massive program of investment in low carbon infrastructure and the transition of the economy towards a sort of a low carbon model, starting first and foremost with the renovation of the country's very sort of energy inefficient building stock, so housing retrofit and things like that, and that this would stimulate the economy at the same time as laying the foundations for shifting it onto a greener and more sustainable basis. Now, in doing that, we'd achieve a number of other goals at the same time. We tackle energy poverty in homes, we create jobs at a large scale, and you would stimulate the kind of markets and the new energy technologies needed to get us moving in the right direction. So it would be a win for people, it would be a win for the environment, and it would be a win for the economy. Now, for a brief moment, for a number of months, they called it sort of the Keynesian moment. There was indeed some sort of a modicum of green stimulus spending. In some countries, it was more significant. South Korea, interestingly, had a huge program of green spending. In Britain, we had something which the government at the time called a Green Deal, but really it was a little bit of money. They called it cash for clunkers, where you could replace your car with a car that lived up to what would be the EU standard energy efficiency. And there was a scheme for taking inefficient housing boilers and swapping them up for more efficient ones. So there was a moment that was hugely missed, massively missed. And so now we find ourselves kind of a decade plus on, and having had some debate about the Green New Deal in 2008. And then some people who were working on the campaign of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States came to Britain to speak to the group of us who had come up with the original Green New Deal, saying, we like this idea, it's got some cultural and historical resonance in the United States, we'd like to do something with it. And they took it back, and of course it then became a huge thing, and it sort of breathed life back into the idea once more. And now, the cycle turns once again, and we find ourselves in a situation where quite unexpectedly, well, even though if you speak to any epidemiologist, they would have told you that sooner or later we were going to experience a pandemic of some sort. We find ourselves in a moment where whole economies have been brought to a standstill, and people are looking around and thinking, how can we build back better? How can we have a green and socially just recovery? And so the policy vehicle of the Green New Deal is back center stage once again, because however you look at it, if you want to improve the quality of life, if you want to improve the quality of the environment, if you want to rebuild the economy in such a way that puts behind us some of the old problems of the old economy being polluting, divisive, unequal, when you look at what you do with the Green New Deal, it has tremendous power about boosting incomes at the level of low-income households. It has a tremendous power to improve quality of life for people who are perhaps most vulnerable and marginal in society by improving the quality of the housing stock, by creating jobs where they're most needed. And it also does it in a way which weans us off fossil fuels, which creating cleaner air for everybody. Because again, whenever we look at the problems with the degraded environment in towns towns and cities, it's really important to remember that those are problems which impact disproportionately on people who are at the bottom of the income threshold. So the Green New Deal is kind of good for the economy, it's good for people, and it's good for society. So we've gone full circle, and we're back at a point where there is again this huge opportunity to do something better, to build back better and have a green recovery.
And when you say, kind of a cyclical, structure, so the term circular economics comes up time and time and again when we talk about green economics. What does this mean, and why is it so different from our own linear economy?
So if you were to try and sort of imagine two really simply different pictures of what an economy is like, and there's a wonderful woman called Jane Jacobs who wrote a short book called The Nature of Economies, when she talks about regenerative or extractive economics. Now, if you have an extractive economics, you might think about it as simply a pipeline where you sort of shove resources in at one end and waste comes out the other. But of course, you can't keep on doing that forever because, we live in a finite, bounded world. The other image is a sort of a circular, a cyclical one, a regenerative one, where you imagine the economy working more like an ecosystem, a healthy, functioning ecosystem, where there is no thing as waste as such. There are merely resources which are cycling around. Now, when you talk about circular economics, this has particular applications for the way that we manufacture, sell, and reuse goods. And a circular economy is one in which you are aiming at zero waste, where all the resources that go into making a product don't end up in a landfill site. They end up being reused, repurposed, reassessed. Now, so that's the circular economy, is the idea of a kind of a green economy, but we've got an additional problem at the moment in that the world as a whole is already massively over-consuming. So if we were to just pause the economy at this point, and even if we were successful at getting a sort of a circular economy, we're at a point in which we've been overusing the Earth's regenerative capacities, its fisheries, its farmland, its forests. So at a global level, we need an aggregate reduction in our amount of consumption of natural resources, but also we're consuming very unequally. So we've both got to reduce in total the amount we consume, but also to redistribute in a way that can allow everybody to thrive and everybody to have a good life. Now that puts a particular obligation on people living in the so-called advanced economies, so advanced we produce ridiculous amounts of waste, in like the United Kingdom, the OECD countries, Europe, North America, etc. So the challenge for us is to find a vision of how we can have good lives, but at greatly reduced levels of overall consumption. Now, one of the things which has been so striking over the last few months during the experience of COVID-19 and the pandemic, with everybody under lockdown, being at home, is, well, quite literally, we haven't gone shopping. We've even had some of the major retailers putting up advice, putting up signs saying, buy only what you need. Well, perhaps that's something that we might have thought about doing anyway. But I think there's been other spin-offs from that too, in that as we sort of haven't been shopping and sort of going out quite as much, people have been finding other ways to entertain themselves, producing their own sort of kind of self-entertainment. We've also kind of almost relearned how to entertain ourselves, how to make and do things for ourselves. It's kind of reskilling. Welcome back to the kitchen and kind of cooking our own food. Now, it's important to say that this experience has been had very differently. There's some people, and especially people in a lot of the lower income jobs, have had to kind of keep going as normal. And it's revealed, in fact, how the existing economy was very divided. And I think hopefully one of the other lessons that's coming out of this experience is that we need to recognize the so-called the key workers who perversely in our economy have been the ones who typically are on the lowest pay, and find a proper way of remunerating and respecting those jobs. And I think there's been there's the importance of a kind of a great re-leveling of the economy in that regard. But where other professions and other demographics are concerned, perhaps the kind of people who have had it slightly easier, but have also been amongst the sort of the more high consuming parts of of our society, that there's an important lesson for us there about how we can sort of readjust our own lifestyles to be kind of consume less, but without having to kind of sacrifice well-being. And in fact, there might even be an uptick in how we experience the quality of our own lives by being more these sort of agents of doing our own thing, making our own things, making our own entertainments, cooking our own food, etc. So I think there's people have kind of it's been a moment when we've been able to kind of step back and take stock in an interesting way.
And I guess as well, it's about, you know, trying to create a system where everyone can thrive in that sense, but without breaking the ecological boundaries, right? So you kind of want to keep, you know, people happy, you want to keep education levels right, you want to keep, you know, freedom of speech, but without kind of going beyond, you know, our world and breaking our own kind of, ecological boundaries in that sense.
Well, it's been really interesting, some of the language that's been kind of thrown up during this period of time when we've been strongly recommended not to engage in sort of unnecessary travel, not to sort of go out buying sort of non-essential or to only buy kind of what you need, essential goods, but raising the prospect that a lot of what we have been buying was kind of non-essential. Perhaps a lot of the travel that we've been engaging in has been sort of not necessary, and perhaps there's an invitation there also to rediscover our own environments, places closer to home, sort of our own country, without having to think that you need to fly around the world on a mini break in order to be able to kind of feel good about yourself. So I think there's lots of ways in which we've been invited to think about how we live and to try to experience things differently, which could create the space, both the economic and the environmental space, for other people to thrive who've perhaps not been enjoying the same level of material consumption that we have. So I think there is this sort of moment where you sort of realize it is possible to kind of live differently and to live well, which opens up more opportunities for others. I mean, the experience of greatly reduced traffic in towns and cities, for example, where people stepped out of their cars, heard bird song, perhaps enjoyed the local kind of parks and open spaces more, made a lot of people aware of the importance of green space in towns and cities. And one of the great challenges dealing with the amount of climate upheaval that's going to be happening anyway with regard to climate change is the great greening of cities. Now, there's an opportunity to make cities both more resilient in the face of extreme weather events, but also more pleasant places to live. So I think reimagining of our urban space with greatly reduced traffic, more space for people and nature, opens up a world in which we can start to kind of enjoy life differently without thinking that the only way of enjoying life is through, endlessly increasing our consumption.
And now let's go on to the Rapid Transition Alliance. Why do we need to seize this moment as we emerge out of the COVID-19 lockdown to push for equality and for, a new form of environmental economics and politics?
Well, one of the most obvious reasons is that we rely upon a relatively stable climate in order for humanity, civilization to function and flourish. And the latest science is telling us that we're already knocking on the door of going across the boundaries set by the international agreements on preventing catastrophic climate change. We've heard that there's a good chance that at some point, even the next 5 or 6 years, that in some places the global average surface temperature increase might cross that 1.5 degree boundary. It might not stay there initially, but it might be the first time that we start knocking on that door, so that we are dancing on the edge of triggering environmental feedback mechanisms, sort of a domino effect, which we may lose control of our ability to contain this process of catastrophic climate breakdown. So we need to act now, we need to act quickly. Now, one of the biggest problems, I think, one of the reasons that we experience so much inertia when we try to achieve change, we've had the language of lockdown for the last few months, but the problem is a lock-in of our carbon-intensive ways of living, our carbon-intensive infrastructure. And whenever you talk about making change at the speed and scale that the science suggests is necessary, people often find it hard to imagine how that would happen. They find it difficult to visualize that. So the point of the Rapid Transition Alliance was to look around for what we call evidence-based hope, where we look at moments throughout history and currently in places around the world where you can see examples, real life examples, where change has happened at the kind of speed and scale that it's going to need to happen in aggregate all around the world. So you can look at moments, for example, looking a bit further back in history. Today, we think of trains as being the environmental alternative to cars. Well, for example, in the middle of the 19th century in Britain, there was a 7-year period in which we laid between 4,000 and 5,000 miles of new train tracks. It was a kind of a speed and scale of engineering and creation of a new infrastructure, which today we think of as a low carbon infrastructure, which has been unimaginable in more recent times. Or you might look to that more recent occurrence during the financial crisis, where overnight we found that we were able to find the resources to do things which conventional economic policy had been saying was impossible. We were able to kind of repurpose, effectively nationalize the banks. We could have done an awful lot more. We discovered the magic money tree, quantitative easing, which was actually a wasted opportunity, because when all that public money was effectively created back then, it was just used to kind of reflate the banks and make sure that their accounts kind of looked okay. But that could have been used in a really productive and directed way to invest in the low carbon transition. And we're back at that moment again when we can do that. And in terms of imagining how things might be different, and how some of the things about high carbon living that we've taken for granted, like sort of cheap flights, for example, you can think of other moments of change when different ways of operating have become apparent, like the time when the unpronounceable Icelandic volcano erupted in 2010, and the whole of the aviation industry in sort of Northern Europe was sort of turned off, like a switch being flicked overnight, and people had to find other ways of doing things. And what did they do? The sky didn't fall on our head just because we couldn't fly. What happened was people turned to other ways of getting around. They sort of car shared, they sofa surfed, they used social media. The supermarkets that had been flying in, fresh salad produce from other continents turned to local suppliers to replace it. There was the example of Jens Stoltenberg, the Norwegian Prime Minister, who was stuck at the UN in New York. What did he do? He ran the Norwegian Parliament from his iPad.
Yeah, I saw that.
When things what we find in moments like the pandemic is that when we have to do things differently, we find we do have the ability to do that. I think the trick we need to learn is to realize that we always have that ability and that agency to cleverly find better ways of maintaining our quality of life, but living with a much reduced ecological footprint. And we need to do that now. So the point of the Rapid Transition Alliance was to show the incredible range of examples about different ways of growing our food, different ways of getting around, different ways of entertaining ourselves, different ways of making decisions at local levels, different ways of working with nature. And if you go to rapidtransition.org, you can see dozens of examples like this from different parts of the world and throughout history that show just how good we are when we try making these changes quickly. Now, what we need to do is to realize that that is always our option, to let go of that bad habits we've got from a particular way of doing economics and particular ways of kind of assuming things, taking things for granted. The 3-car household, the however many times a year you might sort of fly on holiday, and realize that there are alternatives where you don't have to sacrifice quality of life, but you do have to think about doing things a bit differently.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people will agree with you there. And I think so many people have now, coming out of lockdown, realized the importance and, the ability that we can be more sustainable. And it's actually really quite easy. The only problem is our government don't seem to realize that. We've got these figures came out 2 days ago, but France is spending 13 billion on its green recovery measures. You've got Germany looking at 35 billion. The EU as a whole, I think, is pursuing a 1 trillion green, new deal. And what is your take on the UK's kind of recovery package that Rishi Sunak announced 2 days ago? Do you think that it even measures up to that, or not really?
Well, it's a really, really good question. And where the UK in particular is concerned, we've noticed how the government have liked to use the language of Roosevelt's New Deal, which incidentally was the inspiration for our version of the Green New Deal in 2008. Now, what's interesting about that is that they've talked about Roosevelt and they've talked about the New Deal. If you look at what was done during the New Deal, They spent about 3.5% of GDP on the New Deal package. If you translated that to the UK today, that would be spending about 77 billion on our sort of green recovery. The dedicated amounts looking at the green aspects of the recent spending package from the UK government are around about sort of 1.5 billion. Now, yes, there's a few other things going on, but it's clearly not at the scale necessary. It's important to remember that with many of the measures that you would be looking at investing for the green recovery, these are things that not only pay for themselves, but have the massive additional benefits of reducing health bills, of insulating ourselves from price shocks on the global energy markets, of tackling other problems like fuel poverty. So at the moment, when it's effectively free for the government to borrow because of where interest rates are at, when you look at the potential of how you could do things like quantitative easing in a more directed and focused and productive way, there's no excuse for not doing things at a much bigger scale. Now, the government are doing some things, but they're equally also propping up some of the bad bits of the economy. You know, the fossil fuel sector and the fossil fuel intensive sectors of the economy are also kind of getting bailed out. So in a sense that, you know, giving with one hand and taking away with the other, cancelling out the benefits of doing things. So I would say that the challenge for the UK government is having a much more coherent programme in which we stop funding the bads, and a much more ambitious program where we see the multiple benefits of putting far more resources into achieving what we need to achieve. Now, in one sense, when we think about the need, there are things that we need to do anyway to make society a better place. But of course, all the time stalking us is this prospect of climate breakdown and the climate emergency. Now, where that's concerned, there are no half measures, because you cannot negotiate with, you know, with physics and chemistry with political gestures. We have to start doing things at a scale which is going to get us onto the 1.5 degree pathway, which we've committed to through international agreements. And even with the 1.5 degrees, you know, there are parts of the world who are already at the global rough average temperature rise pre-industrial levels of between 0.8 and 1.2 degrees who are already suffering. So even aiming for 1.5 degrees accepts that there are still going to be some, you know, bad things happening in the world, but we need to get on that pathway. We're committed to it, we've agreed to it, and we need to have policy measures which are commensurate with that. And as you've already pointed out, there are other countries which are seeing the sense in doing so. Quite apart from anything else, even from the point of view of, you know, the industrial sector, this is where the opportunities for development are going to be, and it makes no sense not to move in that direction.
And so I guess you've kind of really already answered this question, but to those who believe that a Green New Deal requires, you know, billions and trillions of pounds that we just don't have, you know, as a nation, why isn't that the case? You know, why do you think it's so important now to invest into our future with regards to the climate crisis?
Well, it's a kind of it's one of those kind of basic points which is it's almost kind of embarrassing to talk about. One of those great economists called J.K. Galbraith said this kind of, the thing about money is, you know, that people like to make it seem, you know, really complicated and confusing. In fact, you know, money isn't a kind of a solid and tangible thing. It's a social contract. It's a way that it's something that we've kind of invented. It's quite literally a made-up thing, and because it's a made thing, there was a wonderful guy who was one of the innovators who came up with a thing called LETS, local exchange trading schemes, and he kind of made the point about saying, you know, money is like a kind of a unit of measurement, and saying that you don't have enough money to achieve what you want to do is a bit like saying you don't have enough sort of inches with which to build a house, or you know, it's missing the point. We've seen, and it's been demonstrated that when action is necessary, we saw it in the financial crisis, we're seeing it now during the pandemic, that where there is a political will, where there is a consensus, where there is a kind of a plain understanding that we simply need to do something, resources can be found, they can be created to do that. Now, it is also the case that there are all these multiple benefits that come from investing in the green transition, the socially just and green transition at the moment. There is really no reason not to do so, even if you took it from an incredibly mainstream conventional economic point of view at the moment. There are so few, there are almost no reasons not to, because the cost of finance is so low, the obvious benefits are there, the clear economic need is there. So the only thing that would prevent you from doing that is if you were clinging to some other old ideological baggage, or you just didn't believe in your own ability to achieve that change. Now, I think this country has shown what an incredible place it can be when people do come together. And the most striking insight of the last few months of the COVID-19 crisis has been people discovered overnight that, yes, it was more important to put public health and public interest above old-fashioned notions of short-term economic interest. We reorganized ourselves to pull together, to look after each other and do what was necessary. Now, standing here and looking forward, looking at the challenges of inequality, looking at the challenges of the climate crisis, why can we not apply that same logic to that? Because all the opportunities are there, and there is virtually no downside to doing so and a huge upside to doing so.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess the factors that have been hindering the desperately needed economic and, you know, political climate action, do you think this stems from neoliberalism or austerity, or do you think there are any other factors that play a role in that? You know, just to help people understand why this stuff, which seems so obvious to us, hasn't been happening.
I think there's a few obvious things. How do we get locked into doing what we've always done and not changing? We get locked in a number of ways. We get locked in by a physical infrastructure which has been very fossil fuel dependent, which makes it, you know, you can cycle and you can walk, but there are some points where you are locked into a fossil fuel intensive physical infrastructure. So we need to change the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure. Then there's the kind of the economic infrastructure, the kind of the price incentives which kind of encourage certain ways of behaving, disencourage other ways of behaving. That's been geared towards business as usual. We need to change those economic kind of incentives and signals to do more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. Then there's habit and culture, which locks things in. We're still surrounded by acres of advertising which kind of push high carbon lifestyles, keeping on living as we've always done. I think we need to kind of change the cultural environment to encourage us to see the possibilities and the advantages of doing things differently. There is an economic ideology which has been tenacious, so-called neoliberalism, as you put it, which has locked in that old economic way of doing things. I think we're becoming clearer at seeing that for what it was, and I think it has had its own crisis of confidence, and I think people are moving on from that. And I think people need to be able to kind of see the possibility of doing things differently. So we need to kind of talk about it and share and show when we are living differently and able to do things differently. So I think that will help us. And there's also, of course, there's power as well. And there are vested interests. There are economic interests there who benefit from the status quo and of there being no change. And that has to be flushed out and that has to be confronted. Now, the good thing is that there's also emerging economic interests who are vested in change, the sunrise sectors of the green economy. And we hope that as they grow larger, that balance of power will shift. And I think we've got to be very tenacious in seeking out where there are these sort of short-term vested interests or holding back the process of more progressive change. So I think it's perfectly understandable. Once you sort of start ticking through the boxes, you can see why there's been inertia, why change has been so difficult. But I think now people are seeing the possibilities, and we've lived through this kind of upheaval, and we've seen how much we can change effectively overnight. That should remove the obstacles from change.
I think as well that gives a lot of people hope coming out of lockdown. That's a lot of people have been able to see kind of the way that we've been able to change, and even as you said earlier, realizing the importance of human connection and our connection with our environment and outdoors. Like, I don't think so many people have ever been on so many walks probably in their lifetime, and so I really hope that plays a role as well.
Hope is the best breakfast every day when you wake up. Obviously, I like toast and marmalade as well, but hope is the best breakfast. On the side.
And this is actually just a separate question, but something which I really wanted to get your opinion on. Do you think that wealthier nations should pay climate reparations to developing countries who are currently being hit hardest, by the effects of climate change?
In the 1990s, I worked on a campaign for the cancellation of the debts of some of the lowest income countries, which ultimately was kind of partially successful and is still an ongoing process. But it struck me at the time that if you just changed the kind of accounts that we were using, and instead of looking at sovereign financial debt, you looked at ecological debt, you looked at a natural resource spreadsheet, you would see very quickly that it was rich countries who were indebted to poor countries through our overuse of finite natural resources. And I think as you start talking about ecological debt, and you can look at climate change as being a kind of a clear example of that there is a kind of a this terrible paradox in that the people who've had the least impact on this increasingly sort of systemic environmental crisis are the ones who are suffering most from it. So I think starting from the point of view that if you imagine the world as a kind of a whole economy and then compare it to what you would do in a national economy, that there are mechanisms you have in a national economy to redistribute wealth and income to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to live a half decent life. Now, at a global level, there is the need to do that also, because for the legacy of history, the legacy of everything from the legacies of colonialism and exploitative and extractive patterns of world trade, which also continue, there is this great global inequality, and there is a great inequality today on a daily basis in terms of how much of the Earth's biocapacity we use up. So there's both an accumulated inequality and a day-to-day continuingly sort of accumulating inequality in the way that we do that. So I think there need to be mechanisms globally that redistribute in the light of that great historical and continuing inequality. I think there's a necessity, apart from anything else, because as we experience, when you have the impacts of climate upheaval, for example, making states sometimes ungovernable, forcing large numbers of people to be forced to flee from their homes for no fault of their own because of the impacts of climate change. When you look at some of these spin-offs from habitat destruction and climate change, the increase in vector-borne diseases, and indeed, the pandemic itself being an example of zoonosis, the crossing out of a virus from an animal population to a human population. The United Nations Environment Programme tells us that it's going to become more likely with climate change. For all these reasons, I think that you can call it reparations, you can call it necessary redistribution, call it what you like. I think to make the world a safer place for everybody and to live up to our obligations for poverty, tackling poverty globally, that it's necessary that there are transfers of wealth and resources and opportunity from those who are living sort of well above a sufficiency line to those who are not yet at a sufficiency line. So I think there does need to be a significant kind of global settlement around this.
And leading on from that, say we do realize that and that does happen, and then also we start kind of pumping money into fueling the fight against climate crisis. The UK currently measure our economic success by GNP and GDP, right? And so do you think that we need to rethink a new way or a new measurement of kind of our economic and national success? Do you think that needs to be a shift when it comes to the climate crisis? Can we continue to use these methods of measuring success, or do we need a shift in focus?
Well, you've asked me one of my favorite questions there, and looking at different ways of kind of measuring the success of the economy is for all sort of ecological and environmental economists is sort of one of our favorite pastimes. It's important to point out that it's over 50 years since Robert Kennedy, as a an already established and still aspiring sort of American politician, said that the problem with GDP was that it measured everything in life apart from that which makes life truly worth living. And it's important also to remember that the original architect of GDP as a form of national income accounting, Simon Kuznets, said, whatever you do not use the measure of GDP to measure the broader success of your economy and the well-being of your people. You know, it had a health warning on it when it was invented, and it's also kind of a relatively recent thing. Now, there's a number of different ways in which you can do that. And there's been countless different attempts to come up with different ways of measuring the success of the economy. You can either sort of subtract from your national income your environmental damage and all your social ills, and there's been a number of different ways of doing that. Or you can start from a completely different place. And one of the measures that we devised when I was working with the New Economics Foundation is to look at meaningful human outcomes from economic activity, which might be, you know, your experience of your own life, your well-being, your level of life satisfaction, and your life expectancy. So how many relatively long and happy years do you have in your life? And then compare that to what it takes in terms of your use of the environment and natural resources to get that, so your ecological footprint. And we came up with an indicator that we called the Happy Planet Index, which was in effect a measure of the ecological efficiency with which a society is able to produce relatively long and happy lives for its people. And when you do that, really interesting things start happening. You see that the wealthiest countries do very badly because we have very large ecological footprints. Very poor countries do very badly because they have relatively low life expectancies. Interestingly, a lot of the middle-income countries, Latin American countries, seem to have come up with ways of having, relatively high life expectancies and life satisfactions with relatively low ecological footprints. Interestingly, the areas of the world, all around the world, who did absolutely best were small island states. And one can conjecture there that quite often in small island states, for reasons of geographical isolation, economies have developed in more cooperative ways, and people are more aware of the physical and environmental limits that they live with. So yes, I do think we need fundamentally different ways of measuring the success of our economies, which look at meaningful human outcomes like life satisfaction, well-being, life expectancy, and comparing that with how successfully or not we are living within our planetary ecological boundaries.
And just to add to that, I know from your book that there is actually a place which has gross national happiness, and that's Bhutan, isn't it?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah,
They
and
formally
so
have that as their way of measuring the economy.
A tangible example that this is possible, that we can actually imagine and see this now.
Absolutely right. And this is the interesting thing, is that I once played a game. It was an economic policy, a sort of a policy equivalent of fantasy football, where I sort of sat down and tried to imagine that if there had a perfect polity, a perfect sort of nation with the kind of the greenest energy system, the greenest transport system, the best form of invigorating daily democracy, what would it look like? And I sort of wrote down all the characteristics I would like it to have. And then for each of those characteristics, I then thought, well, I wonder if this already exists somewhere in the world. And it did. So all the answers are already out there somewhere. Our task is to stitch them together.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And I mean, just to make you elaborate on that a little bit more, we always ask at the end of every interview, what does a sustainable future look like to you?
I think it looks like a world in which everybody gets their basic material needs met, in which we have time for friendship, for creativity, and that we do that in a way which does not pull the rug from us environmentally in a way that means future generations won't be able to enjoy the same.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
You're welcome. Lovely to chat.
Thank you.